The Callisto Protocol. Did a poor launch clip the wings of a fledgling IP, or was it destined to always live in another shadow? What is going on, Tenant Crew? My name is Billy the Squid, and today I want to talk about the Callisto Protocol, one of my most anticipated games of 2022, and one of my favorite games to come out of 2022. A fresh IP in the survival horror genre, one that is slowly being filled to the brim with remakes and reboots, the Callisto Protocol looked to be a breath of fresh air for horror game fans everywhere. Unfortunately, due to several factors that we'll discuss in this video, the Callisto Protocol's reception has been mixed, to put it lightly. Which is unfortunate because despite all of the issues that we're going to discuss today, I do think there is a good game and a potentially great franchise behind the Callisto Protocol. But without further ado, let's dive in. And I think the best place to start is with the low-hanging fruit. The Callisto Protocol did not have a good launch. Whenever it launched on December 2nd, the PS4 and PS5 versions of the game ran smooth as butter. That was the version that I played it on, and I had a wonderful time on the launch of the game. This is mainly because the game was made specifically for the PlayStation consoles in mind, and then was then ported out to the Xbox and PC versions. And while console fanboys might argue that Sony paid the Callisto Protocol team to make the game worse on other devices, this couldn't be farther from the truth and is actually backwards. Both Microsoft and Sony are vying for those native versions of the game, and then all other versions from there are ported out separately. Regardless of how it happened, the PS5 version of the game was the native version of the game, and as such, it ran fine. The same could not be said for Xbox and PC, though. The Xbox version of the game suffered from FPS issues, where the stability of the game could go from 60 frames to 30 frames down to 15 frames and back up. Just no consistency whatsoever. This forced a lot of people to play the game on resolution mode, locking the frame rate at 30 FPS, which did seem to stabilize it a little bit, but it is not a fix in the slightest. But these issues were minuscule in compared to what the PC version of the game had going on with it. Similarly to the Final Fantasy VII Remake port that came to the PC, Unreal Engine 4 has a real problem with its shader compilation, and both of these games, Final Fantasy VII Remake and the Callisto Protocol, suffered from shader compilation issues. To put it into layman's terms, whenever you play through the game is loading shaders as it progresses, causing the game to have an extreme stuttering issue, making it borderline unplayable, if not entirely unplayable. The Callisto Protocol team immediately made a statement, owning up to the fact that it was a clerical issue on their end. Due to the rush process of getting the game out, they did miss the proper shading compilation, and this was causing the game to compile the shaders as it went. Within 24 hours, a day one patch was issued to the game, which would cause the game to compile all the shaders at the start menu. While the title screen still stuttering while the shaders were compiling led people to believe that the issue was not fixed, once the shaders had successfully compiled, the game could be played as normal. 4 days later, another patch came through that added a shader compilation status bar, giving players some feedback onto why the title screen was stuttering and when they were able to play the game successfully. Patches continued to go out for FPS issues throughout the game, and by December 16th, the game was running equally well on all three stations. But unfortunately for the Callisto Protocol team, no matter how quick they worked, the damage from day one was already done. The Callisto Protocol on Steam had already been review bombed on the Steam review boards, as well as every gaming journalist under the sun really putting their full effort into making sure everybody knew how bad the game was. Unfortunately for Striking Distance Studios, this was just the cherry on top of some of the issues that they had even before the game had already launched, from two different sources, one from Japan and one from EA. The Japanese rating boards had been looking heavily into the Callisto Protocol and had been in communication with Striking Distance Studios, trying to figure out what they could do to bring the game in line with Japanese censors. After several back and forths between the Japanese rating board and Striking Distance Studios, it was decided by the studio that they were just going to cancel the release of the game in Japan rather than sacrifice the creative vision, and offered full refunds to anybody that had already pre-ordered the game from that country. The reasoning being that Japan is particularly weird about what kind of gore they allow into their media, specifically dismemberment. A similar issue happened back in 2020 with The Last of Us Part 2, which also featured ways of dismembering enemies. In that case, Naughty Dog and Sony Studios ended up removing dismemberment entirely from the Japanese release of The Last of Us Part 2. And this is a place where I can give Striking Distance Studios a little bit of credit. They didn't want to sacrifice their creative vision for the game just to appease the global market. And while I might see this as a positive, the marketing teams would definitely see it as a negative. Japan is the third biggest video game distributor in the global market, making up about 16% of video game shares globally. And with them refusing to conform to the Japanese standards, this market was completely cut off from their revenue sales. And they had investors believing that they were going to sell 5 million units within the first year of launch. Deals like this, along with other external factors, a few months after launch, they have already reduced their expected numbers to 2 million copies sold by the end of the year. The developers are still optimistic though, stating that with the planned content and support for the game moving forward, that interest in the game can be revitalized and that those sales numbers should be met. That hasn't stopped gaming journalism to continue bashing the game, using its low sales figures as more steam for the hate train. A secondary factor affecting that bottom line was EA and its announced Dead Space remake, one that was coming out just a month after the Callisto Protocol. And this is partially self-inflicted, as Striking Distance Studios is headed by Glen Schofield, who used to work for EA as one of the co-writers for the Dead Space trilogy. Working for a subsidiary of EA known as Visceral Games, the Dead Space trilogy came out under Glen Schofield's watch, and in 2017, when EA decided that single-player games were out and multiplayer games were the new hotness, they cut Visceral Games loose. Hopefully seeing this as a blessing in disguise after what EA had done to Dead Space 3, Glen Schofield then formed Striking Distance Games, along with 30 of the Visceral Games employees and a plethora of other developers from the industry. And Glenn in the studio was not shy of flexing their past works as an advertising agent for the Callisto Protocol. An announcement trailer that was riddled with Dead Space references, constant advertising that this game is going to be a spiritual successor to that Dead Space formula. It is impossible for people not to make the comparison of this to Dead Space. And that was what the studio wanted. I'm not sure when EA decided that they were going to revitalize the Dead Space series into a Dead Space remake, but it could not have been worse timed for the Callisto Protocol, because at that point direct comparisons were inevitably going to be made, more so than they already were. With the price of games rising in the current market, and two games coming out so close together with similar tones, one being a spiritual successor to a franchise and the other being a remake of that same franchise, the one thing the Callisto Protocol had going for it was that it had that earlier launch window. Unfortunately, with how botched that launch was, it could be easily seen that consumers that hadn't made a decision yet could be easily swayed to the former game. You also have the subsect of gamers that don't know any of the history behind the studios, don't know that this game was made by the ex-Dead Space developers, and they just see a game that looks like a blatant ripoff of the Dead Space formula. That mixed with negative reception of the game, and the hate train just keeps rolling. But despite all of this, at the beginning of the video I said this is one of my favorite games to come out of 2022, and I'm sticking with that. Because from a gameplay perspective, I feel like this is a very good start to a new IP. While the story might be cherry-picked directly from Dead Space 1, one of those kind of you can copy my homework but don't make it obvious type things, I feel like the character work, while not to like God of War standards of character development, is stronger in this game than what it was in Dead Space. Same thing goes with the mechanics of the game. I enjoyed Dead Space, so a game that is basically more Dead Space is okay with me. One of the most unique features of this game, and one that I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate on for enjoying, was the melee-centered combat. The survival horror genre is notorious for increasing the tension of their games by intentionally making the main character of the game control poorly in one way or another. Many times this is some arbitrary factor such as the main character is not combat experienced, so they're going to shoot worse than what you're used to in like an FPS game. There's also other limiting factors that games use, such as whenever you're using your weapons, you can either not move or you move extremely slowly. Rarely, if ever, do these game studios go out of the box and try to input some sort of unique control function that's actually going to make players think and have that unfamiliarity with that control style be the limiting factor. And I'll give the Callisto Protocol credit. Having the left joystick, your movement command, being your basis for both dodging and blocking, I think was extremely well done in this game, despite what a lot of people will say. And I had a lot of fun utilizing it. The hate for this mechanic in general, I feel, is extremely unjustified, considering if you know how to do the cha-cha slide, you know how to dodge in Callisto Protocol. There's even an accessibility option so that you don't have to alternate back and forth for the dodging. You can just hold the joystick in one direction and dodge consistently on that, making it so that all you have to do is read the enemy's input, and whenever they stop swinging at you, you swing at them. This constant in-your-face tension, the game wanting you to go into melee range and actually duel it out with these enemies, makes a tension that's different from your typical survival horror game. And having everything directly in the player's face makes it all that much more visceral and much more satisfying whenever you're dispatching enemies. And once you get used to the cadence of the combat, it is easily one of my favorite survival horror combat systems. And I can already hear people typing that this system that I'm praising so much falls apart as soon as multiple enemies are on the screen. And to that I say, you are not using all of your tools properly if that is the case. And by tools, I mean your firearms and the grip system. These tools are specifically made for thinning out a herd so that you don't get overwhelmed. If you're just allowing the entire mob to run at you, you're playing the game effectively wrong. The grip system in particular becomes more and more pivotal the later the game goes, with plenty of one-shot opportunities scattered throughout each one of these areas, whether it be a spike wall, spinning saw blades, or just a nice deep ledge to toss somebody off of. The firearms are also passable and serve their purpose, even if they are a bit generic for this style game. When you come from a game like Dead Space where it has a whole bunch of unique weapons, just having space revolver, 2 space shotguns, and a space machine gun feels like a little bit of a letdown. Combining all of these aspects, in my opinion, creates an extremely satisfying experience throughout the entire runtime of the game. A runtime, while people are calling it short, does meet industry standards for survival horror games, most games being around 10 to 15 hours to play. Callisto Protocol is around 9 to 12 depending on how completionist you are with it. And another thing I want to give this game credit for is how well paced it is throughout this runtime. The game is split into 3 different sections of the game, with your intro segment getting you used to the combat, being more melee oriented. You have less tools to work with. The mid section being a big stealth segment where there's a horde of enemies that if you get alerted to, you're going to have a really bad time. But if you're cautious and calm, you can dispatch them one by one without the others knowing. Followed by the run and gun segment, where you take everything that you've earned through the game and use it to fight your way to the final encounters. Each segment gives a unique feel that keeps the game from getting too samey, in my opinion, something that it could have very easily become if the gameplay systems didn't change very much throughout. Especially considering that the weapons are fairly generic, the enemies are fairly generic, with a few exceptions, and the story is just straight ripped from Dead Space. It's all familiar, but it still has a way, in my opinion, of being exciting and feeling fresh. And I do truly feel for Glen Schofield and the ex-Visceral Games studio employees after EA rug pulled the IP from them, fired them, and then years later decided that they were going to revive that same IP. And while nothing can excuse the poor launch of the game, I do think we should be willing to give this development studio a chance and this title a chance. They were quick to fix the issues and are keeping to their roadmap moving forward. New Game Plus has already been released for the game, somehow sooner than what God of War Ragnarok's New Game Plus mode was. And a roadmap has been laid out with feature content, showing that this studio is going to continue to support the game long into the future. The story and passion project that was formed back during their EA times is clearly on full display here, and they are getting a second chance to retell that story from a different perspective. While I doubt comparisons between the two games will ever truly stop, it does seem like with the most recent updates that people are warming back up to the Callisto Protocol, with the Steam reviews showing mostly positive reviews in the last 30 days. Hopefully this trend continues with the DLCs being released for the Callisto Protocol over the course of 2023, and it can successfully dig out its spot in the survival horror genre, but only time will tell. But I want to know what you think, Tenant Crew. How do you like the Callisto Protocol? Do you think it's overrated? Do you think it's underrated? Did the PC problems affect you? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you want more content like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We will be doing more Callisto Protocol content in the future. But until then, much love, Tenant Crew. Bye-bye.